And now, our feature contemplation.
Speaking Cinema with Andrew Schwartz.
Welcome to the Speaking Cinema podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Schwartz. And before we get going here, I would just like to say that this is the September 1st episode, and the creepy season is upon us. It's coming up pretty much right now, actually. It starts, and just a little advertisement for the near future for the podcast here. We are going to do 3 horror movies, because I love horror. I love horror so much. We're going to do 3 episodes in a row in October. All horror movies. October 1st, October 15th, and Halloween itself, October 31st. All 3 of those will drop as horror movies on those dates. We don't have which horror movies yet, but we will always reveal to you what the movies are going to be on social media, on Instagram. Our Instagram is at Speaking Cinema Podcast. 1 week ahead of each time that we're going to drop a movie, we will post what the movie's going to be, so you have a week to watch it on whatever streaming platform it is screening on. So today we have a pretty awesome, beguiling, intoxicating, dreamy, ravishing movie. This is a one-of-a-kind movie. Any David Lynch movie is going to be a one-of-a-kind movie, folks, and this is the first one that we will have done on Speaking Cinema. We are exploring the mysteries of love and Lumberton in David Lynch's 1986 classic, Blue Velvet. And we couldn't have a better guest here to discuss this with us. He's just so good at movies that are like this, that are different and out there and just something special. And he's very talented at breaking them down, understanding them, and communicating to us what they mean. And that's what we're all about here. This is the only podcast about cinema exclusively about the meaning in the movies. And with that, I give you the great returning guest, Nicholas Stonehouse. Stonehouse, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks a lot for having me back. I really appreciate the chance to come back and do this again.
Oh, yeah. Well, last time we talked about The Wailing, and that was a horror, speaking of horrors, and we had a whale of a good time. And today, we're going to have one hell of a time trying to make sense of and break down this movie. Blue Velvet is really something interesting and something special. It's a timestamp. It's different things to different people. And so it's always a fun challenge for us to dive in here and try to make some sort of sense, whether it's subjective or objective. I think in this case, probably more subjective, of the movie. Because when you ask 6 different people what a movie is like or what a movie is about, and you get 6 different answers, that makes me raise my eyebrows and say, hey, that's interesting. Let's take a look under the hood here and see what this thing actually is, at least to us individually. So
you could get 6 different interpretations from the same person on this movie, I think, and 6 different ways of feeling about it. And I think that's
right.
Intentional. I think it is, very tonally jarring. It shifts a lot. It's really amorphous, and you can't really pin down one thing or the other to describe it.
Yeah. And David Lynch is such a special director, I think, for that reason. We see a movie that's of Lynch, and it's very often like that, right? If not all the time, where he seems to do something and go somewhere, and then just as I think I know what's going on, or I'm getting what he's giving me, this is what this movie really is, okay, then he subverts, right? You think he's going to zig, he zags, and he doesn't just zag, he zags in style. Like, he gives you something insane, he gives you weird characters, he gives you weird emotions, weird music, and it's all kind of, fits together in some sort of mad genius kind of way. This symphonic, so many instruments, so many layers, so many melodies, doing, work with each other, that there really is a textured feel to what's happening, whether you like it or not. And to me, when filmmakers make movies that feel textured, it's very special. And this one is literally textured because it's called Blue Velvet, and velvet's a texture. And so we're going to go into that soon with the title take. But what I would like to do is start out with a log line. We always like to do that to introduce the movie here. So let's get right into it, Stonehouse. The log line for Blue Velvet is: The discovery of a severed human ear found in a field leads a young man on an investigation related to a beautiful, mysterious nightclub singer and a group of psychopathic criminals who have kidnapped her child. So what's your first impression when you hear that?
My impression of that is it does describe exactly what the plot is, and that's about it. And
Yeah.
it you can't really describe, oh, this movie is more about themes and tone and explorations of the American idea. You're not going to put that in your description of,
Yes.
the plot of the movie, because it's not really
Yeah.
part of the straightforward plot.
In a parable about the American dream, comma, one man. Yeah, exactly. It's
So someone that actually wants to watch a normal mystery noir movie might rent this and be like, oh, this looks great. And then they watch it and they're like, what have I gotten myself into?
But that's what I love about this. Like he sinks his hook into you, and in my opinion, it's very gripping, and it's hard to look away. It's hard to stop the movie. It's hard to not want to know and understand what the next moment is going to be. There's such rhythm here, right? There's such like velocity happening in the images, in the narrative, even in the dialogue. I'm not saying that it's all perfect and that Lynch is a perfect director and all these kinds of things. I think it's very, well, I don't know if acquired taste is the right way to put it, but particular taste, maybe I would say. But there's something so gripping about his movies in general, and this one too, even at its slow pace. It's technically a slow movie, right? Not that much happens. Things happen, but they take a while to happen. They're drawn out. It's not like you're bombarded with plot elements here. It's a lot of atmosphere. It's a lot of different kinds of things that are swirling around what this logline says. Yeah, someone finds a severed human ear, right? But that's the tip of the iceberg, right? And what's cool to me is that you read a logline like this, someone finds this, it leads them on this, it's related to this, and then there are these kind of characters, right? It's fun for me to see a logline like that and think, oh, this is just like a sort of by numbers mystery, noir, maybe kind of thing, a puzzle we have to put together, right? And then Lynch comes in and gives you the actual movie that he gives you, just to me absolutely eviscerates what your expectations are going to be, even when you have a log line like this. Hey, here are the plot elements in play here, right? Hey, here are the basic characters. And yet, when you're watching the movie, it's as if you never even read a log line. But all that stuff is in there, making the movie go.
You were talking about him subverting. That's kind of what he's doing here, where he's like, this movie is about a mystery and a crime, and then it just veers off into the territory it goes into. And you're saying that you like you like Lynch, and you think maybe he's not perfect. I totally agree. I think I really appreciate him, and I think he's singular in the industry. I think when you're watching one of his movies, for better or worse, and maybe we can get into some of that later, but I think he's definitely of his like own league that nobody can really be in, and many people probably wouldn't want to be in. And you can't really trace his style or the way he does things to really copying anyone. I think he's very unique in that sense. If he is kind of borrowing any influence, it's probably more from like underground experimental film. Nobody that we would really know, or maybe some people like myself that took the experimental film class in high school might know. But he might be pulling from those kind of influences, and that's why he takes those underground experimental things that nobody's seen, brings them to American and worldwide cinemas, and people see this kind of stuff for the first time. I think that's why he's reached the level of acclaim and success and appreciation among fans. So, and then, there's people like us that agree with that, but I might not be giving 5 stars to Eraserhead when I first saw it. So this brings me to the last thing I wanted to say about the logline. It's that with someone like David Lynch, I think the simpler the log line is, the more concerned you should be for your movie going experience. Because I'm sure the log line for Eraserhead is like a man has a baby or something like that. And that belies many things about the movie.
Right. Because where there's a more simple description, there's going to be more room for Lynch to slide in there and disturb and creep the hell out of you. It's like, oh, there's no plot happening here. Well, then I guess I'm just going to make, a gigantic deformed person start dancing and start like spray fire on everyone, or whatever it is, some sort of a circus act. So no, I love his films. I really do. Most of them I absolutely love. I find some more strong than others, for sure. But this movie is very fascinating because I kind of feel like, aside from Eraserhead, which you could argue is perhaps the most Lynchian movie of all of Lynch's movies, which is kind of startling, but it's his first one. But this movie is sort of like the beginning of the Lynch auteurship, you might say. Right? He's found his way of handling narrative and the plot here, because I feel like a lot of the elements that are in this movie start to not necessarily repeat themselves verbatim, but he's finding his signature voice and his way of interpreting certain cinematic elements in this movie, and then he will take that with him in the other movies beyond this, which is always really cool to see a filmmaker that's so influential forming. And I think he was fully formed as an auteur in the style that we have seen him give us so many times after this. There's kind of nothing else like Eraserhead. There's kind of nothing else like The Elephant Man, because he had a lot of help and he was very, very young for The Elephant Man and wasn't quite sure maybe how to do certain things, and he was learning as he went along. I feel like this film, which is about 10 or so years, 9 years after Eraserhead came out, by now, the guy knows what he's doing, and he's making choices very deliberately for specific reasons. So it's very cool for that reason.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree that this is like kind of up in the upper echelon of his movies. And you were saying he might not repeat himself exactly later on. I think he does. I think he repeats himself exactly from this point on. And that's why I think from The Elephant Man and Blue Velvet on, there's not too many things that I really feel the same way about as these two movies. And I want to get to some of these because I wrote down a list of things that I think he repeats, and they get more and more specific as it goes on. So the first thing is that you get him switching characters' perspectives halfway through. You get this in Mulholland Drive. You kind of start with one character and end with another. And have you seen Twin Peaks: The Return, the sequel series?
I have not yet. That's the newer one.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, no.
Worth a watch just for the interest of following, his authorship, like we're talking about right now. Might be kind of challenging at times because it's, a TV series of this kind of thing stretched out to a bunch of episodes. And there's also a switch of character perspectives halfway through, but that one is with the same character who changes so substantially that it is essentially a new character. So it's very interesting in that way. But so that's the first thing. He does blonde brunette doppelgangers a lot. Have you noticed that?
Oh yeah, sure.
You have it in Mulholland Drive. You have it in Twin Peaks. You have a lot of kind of spying on intimacy, which is a whole big thing in this movie. You have a man gets struck by light and then promptly disappears. This happens in Lost Highway, and it happens in Twin Peaks: The Return. You have a short, strange man who talks kind of weird. This happens in Twin Peaks. It happens in Twin Peaks: The Return. You could argue that he's not that short in The Elephant Man, and it's not really his fault that he talks weird, but I mean, he does.
Yeah.
You have physical comedy by a gang of stooges. We have this in Blue Velvet. I think the gang that Frank employs, there's a lot of goofy stuff they're kind of doing in the background.
Sure.
They're almost doing Looney Tunes, like, whatever you say, boss, kind of antics
Right.
going on. And it really distracts me sometimes.
Right.
And in Twin Peaks: The Return, you have these guys who work at a casino, and they just act in a very similar way.
Yeah. A lot of these things also show up in Wild at Heart as well.
I've never seen Wild at Heart. I gotta see. I gotta see another classic
one.
Nick Cage performance.
I love that one. But yeah, do go on.
So I only have 2 more left, and they get more and more specific. He repeats this point: self-destructive woman being taken advantage of, who then makes a plan to escape. Fire Walk with Me, Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive.
Yeah.
My final one. I love this one because you'll never guess what it is, but once
it's definitely like lamb fetuses get stabbed and then explode. Oh no, okay, go on.
Portal to a bizarre realm through a nondescript housing fixture. In Eraserhead, we zoom into that. What do you call it? The heating thing.
The radiator.
The radiator, yeah.
Yeah.
You zoom into that, and then all of a sudden you're on stage. In Twin Peaks, you have the curtain that you go behind to go into the Black Lodge.
Sure.
In Twin Peaks: The Return, there's no other way to say this. A man transports himself into a spatial void through an outlet.
Yep. It's great stuff. I guess you could split hairs, right? But I said he didn't repeat himself verbatim, but he does repeat himself for sure. And if you know the filmmaker, right, you know what you're getting. Right? What you're not getting is a surprise in the sense of, I'm surprised by the style. I'm surprised by even the plot. It's more like I know what your world is. I know what your galaxy is, the things that revolve around in your brain and in your mind, and I want to spend a couple hours there. And okay, I'm going to spend a couple hours with a strange man with gigantic hair, right? And then, here's another one. I'm going to spend a couple hours with this guy that's obsessed with Elvis and his insane sort of boppity, uppity love interest. That's Wild at Heart. It's one of those kind of things, but it's always fascinating to see how that world manifests itself on the screen, right? With the sounds and the sights and the actors who are part of that world. And the actors always have something very interesting to say about what it's like to be in these movies, because they all pretty much say the same thing. It's like, you're on set, Lynch tells you something to do, you have absolutely no bearing on why or what he's telling you, but you go with it and you watch this sort of this psychotic sausage being made, and then they watch it on the screen and they say, it makes sense in that it makes sense for him and to him. And that there's something very like valiant about that to me as a filmmaker. It doesn't mean that everyone has to like the films, right? But he is a mad genius of a sort, or that type. I don't like to use the word genius at all usually, but it's just more for the sort of euphemism. And whether you like it or not, that's completely up to you. But to watch someone's brain be on the screen is always fascinating.
Yeah, I think his fans tend to see him as this kind of tortured artist, bearing his dark soul on the screen. And I don't think that's him at all. I think he's interested in telling stories in his own fun, weird little way. Because all of his movies have a sense of humor, and they all have a darkness to them. They all have that sort of balance. But I wouldn't say he's a self-serious filmmaker at all.
No, I think he's quite romantic, actually. So I would agree with you. He has a very dark sensibility. There's a dark lens through which everything passes, right? And that's just how he sees the world. I look across the room, I see a table. He sees the same table. But what we both understand about what the table is and everything that's revolving around the table and what it means for it to even be there in the first place, these are the things that start to separate us. And we start to get into art and interpretation when we talk about this. So, I see that table and I'm like, oh, I'm excited to prepare my lunch on there and it's going to taste so good. And then he says, well, I'm excited to shoot a deformed person being chopped up into pieces and everyone laughing about it on there, So it's just interesting how everyone thinks about things differently, and perspective is a huge part of Lynch's approach to cinema. And like I said, it's a distinctive voice, and like you said, it's very singular, I think is the word you used. And it's always fun to see someone that has, whether you agree with it or whether it's pleasant or not, someone that has a very specific, distinctive, and singular, unique view on what life is like, and then turning that into art and seeing what happens at the end of the project when it's all done and all of this twisted person's decisions are made, and it's in the can, it's edited, all of his approval is on every moment, and then the projector starts and you look at the wall and you're like, well, that's what he came up with this time. That's amazing. So it's just really cool to see how everyone kind of interprets stuff. So before we go to the opening, Stonehouse, of this very intriguing filmmaker's movie, seminal movie, rather, let's take a look at the title quickly, because I really want to get into the meat here. Blue Velvet is our title. It's a song name, and it's descriptive of a certain type of silky material. So what is your first impression of the title, Blue Velvet?
My first impression. Oh, do I get to break out my David Lynch impression now? Is that finally time for me to...
Here on Speaking Cinema, we believe in freedom of will. So you go for it.
This one I think is a real simple answer. I think people are going to read a lot into the meaning behind the title pick, but I think David Lynch was sitting down one day listening to the radio or listening to his own tape or record or something. He goes, he's listening to this song Blue Velvet, and he's like, that would sound good in a movie.
That would be a very nice thing to put in my movie.
I think it'd make a great title for a film.
When he hears a song, like you're saying, Blue Velvet, it's not just that he says, oh, that would make a good movie, right? Because then it seems like the process is very simple. I'm totally agreeing with you. But what I love about him is he'll take that song and he'll shine a light into it like a prism, and then all of these colors appear, and he creates a narrative from it, or creates a feeling from it, and we get all of these elements that are so significant to his style. But he doesn't even try. It's just, I hear this song, I create these images, And I guess now you got me doing the voice too.
It's fun to do.
It really is. It's pretty easy too. I think everyone could do it. It's kind of like, some political figures that are very distinct. But I just think that this title, it could be him telling us, hey folks, this is a song I heard, and then I found it a fun exercise to create a story that kind of revolved around, because he plays the song like 1 million times in the movie, right? From the very beginning, and then all throughout the middle, and it's kind of alluded to at the end.
A really easy interpretation. I think people could think he's thinking about it first and then putting the song in, but I think it's so much easier and makes a lot more sense to say he heard the song and wrote kind of around this, but in his own Lynchian way. He heard the song and was like, what if I put this in a kind of dark setting, because it's such a nice, relaxing, happy song? What if I turn that on its head and used it in a way that made it seem creepy?
Right. It's got that early 50s total innocence to it.
Yeah.
The Americana sort of white picket fence innocence, which we'll talk about more in a second. But and then he just he smashes it into pieces, which is very fun to watch. So speaking of all that, let's segue into the opening image and then opening sequence, Stonehouse. I'm going to summarize for it for everyone, and just in case you haven't seen the movie in a while, and then I'm going to challenge Stonehouse to see what he thought that this all means. So let's get going here. So we open with music, this nice strings, orchestral kind of music, and credits, and including opening title, over a background of a blue velvet curtain, it looks like, kind of blowing back and forth in the wind. And after the directed by David Lynch credit, it fades out, everything fades out, and then we fade into this clear blue sky, while the song Blue Velvet, as we alluded to earlier, by Bobby Vinton plays. And then the camera tilts down to reveal these lush red roses in front of a white picket fence. Okay, then we cut to a shot of this fire truck that drives by, and it's sort of in slow motion, not too slow. It's like probably 48 frames or something like that. And there's a fireman waving as the truck goes by with the Dalmatian on it and everything, very picturesque. Then we crossfade into the same white picket fence, this time with yellow tulips in front of it, also very saturated in color. And then we crossfade again, very dreamlike, to a crossing guard guiding school children across the street. And then we crossfade again, and this time to Jeffrey's parents' house, an exterior shot. And then we see Jeffrey's father, who's watering the flowers with the garden hose on the front lawn. We see Jeffrey's mother, who's inside watching some sort of cops and robbers kind of movie for entertainment, someone with a gun. And then the father has a sudden sort of neck injury outside. Could be a stroke or something, I'm not exactly sure. And he falls to the ground, and the hose sprays everywhere, spraying water. And this dog is barking ferociously while drinking the water and the hose, and this kind of strange segmented sort of post-process effect that Wong Kar-wai uses a lot. And then after that, we zoom into the grass, and we start to dolly in with this extreme close-up of these blades of grass, one by one, closing in further and further. And then we see, right after that, these close-ups of insects of some kind rummaging around under the soil and with these loud scuttling and almost masticating sounds, like they're chewing and chomping on something, maybe each other, and very striking image. And then, right after that, it crash cuts from all of that chomping and chewing to the just dandy Lumberton, North Carolina billboard, a very picturesque, idyllic town billboard, and then some exterior establishing shots of the town of Lumberton. And then we reveal Jeffrey, our protagonist, walking around in Lumberton. So that's what I consider to be the opening image, that clear blue sky to the white picket fence, Stonehouse, and the preceding opening sequence. So what do you think about this? What is Lynch trying to say? And we could possibly go into our full takes here and I guess outline some of the themes that he's already giving us.
Yeah, I think opening on the blue velvet curtain does have a lot of meaning here, I think.
Sure.
The curtain, beyond being the title of the movie, the title of the song, and all that, you're kind of doing a curtain call, like for and maybe an old-timey movie. And this, even though this takes place in the 1980s, it has a very 1950s feel, but it pretty obviously takes place in the 1980s if you look at things like the cars and maybe some of the technology that's around. You can figure it out. But I think he intentionally said it today, but with that 1950s nostalgia feel. But so it's like kind of a throwback to those old times of movies and theater where you open on that curtain. But those days are usually thought of as a red curtain, and he's doing this blue velvet, which is kind of the hallmark of maybe a fancier, swankier club or place, like the club that she's supposed to be playing at, which in itself is not really a nice club, but it pretends to be. And that's kind of a stand-in for what this whole movie and exercise is, that things seem nice on the top, but beneath they're not. And that'll be kind of I think the running theme through the rest of this show that we're doing. And I also think the curtain kind of connects thematically and visually to Twin Peaks. I was just talking about the curtain earlier. Yeah. That we walk through the curtain and we go to the other side of society that we're not meant to see, this weird room with weird people and everything in it in Twin Peaks. So he's kind of doing that here, but in a more cinematic way, less so than TV. Because in TV, you've got a whole bunch of stuff thrown at you so to keep you paying attention. But here, it really demands your focus. And we have the curtain pulling back. It's really a nice fade from that blue to the blue of the sky. I think he's kind of matching the little blue there.
Yeah.
So I like that kind of match cut. And then he's tilting down to the roses and the white picket fence, and you're getting that red, white, and blue. That's America. And that's what this whole next montage is, with the suburban, watering your lawn and waving at the nice fireman, all the people that we know we can trust in our neighborhood.
Yes.
And he's introducing us to that perfect small town America idea. And what's really interesting about this opening image is we're going to talk about this at the end of our episode, because it's also part of the closing image. And what he's done throughout the entirety of Blue Velvet is he's distorted your opening image. And so by playing the same image at the end, it means something completely different to you by the end of the movie, where you saw all these things and you're like, oh, this is my nice little town where I love. And then at the end, you're saying all of these things. I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't feel good about that. All of this is wrong, and it makes me feel bad.
Right. And yet it is the same world that we all live in.
You just understand it in a different way because you have more information. You've learned something new.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And just to mention the colors for a second, I really kind of picked up, especially on the rewatch. Well, I guess my third time seeing the movie in total, that there was this really big, pervasive juxtaposition of blue and red. And yeah, it could mean so many things, but the blue is definitely, for multiple characters, is some sort of hope and something bright and light and pleasant and like a blue sky. And the red is something harmful, and it's like an alert or a prison or blood or violence, aggression, repression, all of these different kinds of things. And I really do think that Lynch uses those two colors very well, the contrast here between them. It's in the nightclub. It's in this opening sequence, rather. There are all different kinds of things happening with the colors in the first sequence, which is very idyllic. It's very like Americana, like you were saying. But he goes on to use, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, the juxtaposition between blue and red very astutely, I think. And it just complements the story very well. But yeah, this opening image, it's very exaggerated. I feel like the point that he's trying to make. It's so ideal. It's so colorful. It's so textural in its saturation and the layers of things, the fire truck, the house, the tulips, and everything. It's like kind of hitting you across the face with all of its splendor and its beauty. And then I think that he likes to do that because what he's about to do later is to just absolutely crush that, crush it into a million pieces, like the ants.
Yeah. And so you also mentioned the kind of extension of that scene where it zooms into the underground. That part is great because just in case you might have shown up to this movie and been like, I thought this was a David Lynch movie, and ignoring that his name was on the titles a minute ago. Like, wow, this seems like I walked into the wrong movie. Well, immediately after we get the happy song with the white picket fence and roses and everybody smiling, happy small town America, you get the zoom in to the decay of like almost what it would be like to be a decomposing corpse underground.
Yes.
And a haunting nothingness of audio that makes it feel like you're caught in the void and being eaten to death by bugs. And that tonal shift, that kind of jarring way he makes you feel really happy to really disturbed. He's really good at it. The way he goes into it and out of it kind of shows you that he's really playing with you and messing around. He's like, all right, well, you're thinking about this. Now you're going to think about this. And now we're going to go back to what we were doing before. he's kind of taking you on that roller coaster ride without maybe thrills like maybe an action movie or a comedy would have, where you're laughing or you're impulsive. You're just more squirming in your seat. And he, in this little sequence there's not enough time for him to do what he does in the rest of the movie, which is say, or what you think of your American ideals might not be as nice as you think. But he is going to slip in a little bit of, hey, have you thought about death recently? And she'll be like, no, I haven't. And I wasn't planning to, but thanks for that.
Yeah. So let's move on into Scenic View, which is this segment where we can jump now to any scene in the movie, now that we've covered the opening a little bit, and we'll qualify everything that we've said. Maybe we'll reveal a little bit more about our takes on the whole movie at some point. But I'd like to go to a specific scene. Stonehouse, do you have anywhere that you want to jump first to get us into the movie and get us going with this?
So I'm going to jump a little bit forward, and then I'm going to go back, because I want to jump forward to when Jeffrey and Sandy are talking together after he had broken into the woman's apartment. And she's like, are you going to keep doing this? Why are you doing this? And she wants to stop. And he's saying he has to continue. He says, I'm seeing something that was always hidden. And that, I think, sums up what's going on in this whole movie, is that we were just talking about that opening image of the innocence at play in the visuals that were given. And Jeffrey, through what he has just done, is peeling back those layers to find out the ugliness underneath. And that'll carry him through, and the other characters and this entire plot through to the rest of the movie, to see something that was always hidden. Yeah,
I absolutely agree. I guess you could say that he gives us that in the bug shot at the beginning. Like you were saying, I mean, he's just screaming at you, listen, viewer, taking you by the collar. This is what this movie is about. If you don't like it, you can leave the theater right now. Because it just so disturbs the tone of the movie until that point. But yeah, when they're talking about that, it's definitely, it's pretty on the nose. And this actually just brings me to something I already want to ask you about, because it's so interesting to me. There's so much criticism of this movie. I was especially reading Roger Ebert's review, because Ebert's fascinating. He really did not like this movie when he first saw it. If you see like the Ebert and Roper, Roper liked it, but Ebert was just not taking it at all. He just said, oh, it's completely unfair to Isabella Rossellini, he was doing to them. And then but what he said was, because there's this campy adolescent kind of dialogue that's outside of that apartment. And I thought those are really good words to describe it. I understand what he's saying. Adolescent as in there's something very unformed about the dialogue. It's also so on the nose, a lot of it. There's another moment in the diner, I think in a different scene, where Jeffrey, Kyle MacLachlan's character, is saying something like, I think it's when he's first explaining to her what his like little master plan is, to go to the apartment and do it and do everything that he does. Life is full of opportunities and we have to take them. And it's very explanatory. And what do you think of that as a basic criticism of stuff before we dive in very specifically here? That the dialogue is very adolescent and campy.
I think it serves the purpose of showing that that's who the characters are. I think they're campy, not cliched necessarily, but they're archetypes. These are the all-American boy and girl. And then we discover through what's that comic, like Archie, isn't that kind of like an all-American kind of group of friends and back in this time? I think he's kind of copying that sort of style of like the gee whiz kind of way of talking and seeing the world. Right. And you take that character and you put them in a David Lynch movie, and that's what you get in Blue Velvet. You have someone who has a fondness for maybe intrigue and adventure, and they go a little too far and discover things that no one has meant to see.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, well, I'm asking because it was very kind of weird for me because I read that review and I watched the Ebert and Roper review of this before I rewatched the movie for the podcast for the first time. And I understood what he was saying before I rewatched. I said, yep, that's how I remember the dialogue being. I liked the movie, but I remember the dialogue being like that and a lot of the moments and so on. But then when I rewatched it, I started to form my take of the movie, which is really just that the movie is about growing up and understanding what the world really is. And it ended up being just as campy and adolescent, so to speak, as I remember it. But I actually loved that and I like the contrast between that and everything that happens inside Dorothy's apartment, Isabella Rossellini's character, her apartment, because, like you said, this is who these characters are. They don't have a full grasp on the world. You know, you basically watch Jeffrey learn what happens in the world, even in his own hometown, in not real time, but during the course of the movie. You just watch this guy grow up and start to understand all of the yin and yang, you know, all of the ugly that comes with the beautiful. You know, he even says in the car with her, why do there have to be people like Frank? You know, he's just sort of emoting in this very young way where you're just sort of like pontificating about something and it's really bothering you. And I realized that this is my take on the movie. It is a coming of age movie. And it's not like, you know, an early adolescent coming of age. It's a late adolescent coming of age. It's going out to college, and that's just the very first step, right? It's understanding all of the inner workings of everything. You can see that tulip and understand and appreciate how beautiful it is against that white picket fence and the clear blue sky when you're a child. But what you don't understand is that you have to stand outside with a hose, gardening, working, tending to those flowers in order to make them what they are, right? And to preserve them so that they have longevity in their beauty, right? It doesn't just happen. There are inner workings to everything. And hey, everything's risky. It's dangerous out there. You could be watering those beautiful flowers, and then, I don't know, something explodes in your neck, and then you're on the floor writhing around in pain, and you're in the hospital, right? And that's what ends up bringing this character, Jeffrey, back to his childhood, back to home, to see how things really are and to understand what the adult life is and what it takes to be a part of it and to maintain love within it. What do you think about that?
The coming of age reading of the movie is just the perfect way, I think, to describe it. And I think the most interesting part of the movie is less the crime story of Frank and more of seeing Jeffrey and Sandy come to terms with the kind of world they're living in. I think that's the most fascinating part of Blue Velvet, is watching these two characters change. And a little challenge I'll have for your listeners would be, I love a good coming of age story that is maybe not in adolescence. Like you were saying, you know, Jeffrey in this is an adult. Mm-hmm. He's graduated high school and is working at his father's shop. So he might have already had his, you know, adolescent coming of age. And this is sort of a second stage of him realizing something about the world and about himself. And the same for maybe Sandy as well. So I love those kind of movies. I can't really list them off the top of my head. So I would love people to send in their recommendations or their list of movies that have that same kind of theme.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it is challenging. And that is always interesting to see because it avoids so many cliches and just things that we just see and hear way too much about. And it's hard to have a unique perspective on it because of that reason. But if you think about it, while you were talking there, it made me think, I mean, I'm always, throughout every stage of my life, I'm always coming of age. You know, I'm always aging, and my perspective on everything keeps changing constantly, like these characters. One incident that happens to you that's extreme. You know, I was driving by, I live in LA, of course. I was driving by and there was a fire that happened because it's the summer, it's the valley, it's very hot. It's 100 degrees out. And there was a fire happening on the highway the other day, and this smoke was enveloping the entire freeway, and all the cars were very slow, but they weren't stopped. But it was quite an image in real life to see this unbelievable cloud of smoke and the cars just disappearing into it and then reappearing out on the other side of it. And even something as seemingly sort of innocuous as that, because it doesn't really affect me as much as it does the firefighters, speaking of firefighters, that were fighting the fire on the side of the road. But just seeing that and smelling the smoke and barely able to breathe as I was driving through it, even with my windows closed. There's this realization that came over to me. Seems obvious, but wow, this happens in the world. This unfair, tragic thing that's completely out of my control. I don't control the sun. It happens in the world. And I have to contend with that, right? I have to drive to work through that. I have to understand it. I have to know that there are people trying to fight it, but they might not. I know it might hurt people. I know that it might kill people. It's just one of those moments in life where you're constantly, I came of age and I'm 32 in that moment. Constantly, things are challenging me to come of age. So I think you can come of age all throughout your life in different ways and all the different phases of life. However, there is something that's still so formative about those like late, early 20s or whatever it is, late teens, early 20s. There's something that is very formative that informs the rest of your life once you start learning about things like that. And yet it's not as rudimentary and fundamental as it is when going through, let's say, adolescence, early adolescence. So it is a very fascinating time in life to return home. That type of change that happens at that life, I remember 10 years ago with my own experiences, is very palpable in a different kind of way. It's not childhood, and it's not late adulthood or mid adulthood. It's something in and of itself. It's something special. And I think that Lynch really remembered that time very strongly here. I mean, Lynch was born in 46. If you think about it, Lynch was 40 already by the time that this movie came out. So he's really remembering what this was like some 18 or whatever years ago, let's say, for himself. And that's another thing that intrigues me about this movie and him as a filmmaker. He's able to tap into all of those deep emotions that happened even so long ago. It's like he really felt everything so strongly in his life, and he's so good at expressing what it felt like. So, very fascinating.
He was born and raised in Texas, was he?
Los Angeles. Oh, no, it's Montana.
Montana. Okay, yeah.
Because he did say it was like a Northwest upbringing, very Twin Peaksy kind of small town. So,
okay.
Yeah. Missoula, Montana.
Yeah, I must have seen, I think I saw a photo of him where he was visiting Texas or something like that. But I knew that he was born and raised in some sort of remote area of the country. And that also informs what we're seeing here, that this, he wants to tell the story of this small town America setting. But that's also probably similar to the way he grew up, and he's putting a lot of his own experiences into it. So the first scene I want to talk about for scenic view is the first night in Dorothy Vallen's apartment. This is where Jeffrey convinces Sandy to help him. They do a little plan for him to sneak into the apartment. He's just curious how she's connected to the ear that he found. That's basically Sandy said that her father works in the police force, and she hears meetings. She heard a lot of talking about what happened, and then a lot of her name, this lady's named Dorothy Valens coming up, and she knows she lives near Jeffrey. So they go to the apartment, and a lot happens. A lot of the classic defining imagery and sounds and lines of the movie happen in this scene.
It's a hell of a scene. I was taken by how emotional the scene was, and I just didn't remember feeling that much. Maybe because I'm a little bit older now, and I understand what it's like to feel trapped in a dire, maybe not dire, but in a situation. This woman, Dorothy Valens, that he finds, is so, there's something so tragic about it. And something that really got me about the scene, I mean, there's so many things about the scene. Obviously, being totally violated in every possible way by Frank Booth, played quite brilliantly and intensely by Dennis Hopper. Aside from just her being violated on the floor in front of this kid, unbeknownst to Frank, of course, was after that, when he holds her. It's actually the poster of the movie, too. When he holds her in that moment, she's kind of bent over like a wet noodle, and he just kind of tries to hold her up and help her keep her sanity after that. She says, "Do you like the way I feel?" As she kind of, wants him to embrace her and then to feel her body and, someone to just latch onto. And she mistakes Jeffrey for her husband, Don. She keeps calling him Don. But when she says, "Do you like the way I feel?" it just hit me like that. That's very emotional to me, because she's clearly some kind of prisoner in here, right? This red, dank-looking apartment. And again, the red fighting against the blue velvet robe that she has that he makes her wear. It's just such a cry for help without crying. Do you approve of me? Are you okay with the way that I am? Do you like the way that my body is? Because she's so horribly abused by Frank that she just feels like this used thing, like a rag doll. To me, it's like she doesn't even feel like a human being. She's just a product. She's just, something that he can beat on whenever he wants to. And it just spelled out her predicament so clearly to me. And it gave that scene so much meaning. It's like everything that we just saw, all of the horror and the terrible sexual frustration and the insanity. This is what her reaction is. Can you please let me know that I'm still a person, that I still have some kind of value, that my body feels good to you, that I'm not just complete nothing.
Yeah, I think the reason this movie and this scene work as a whole is the way he shot this particular scene, in that it makes you complicit, and it doesn't make you he doesn't shoot it in a cinematic way. He's shooting it to make you complicit in what's going on, and to show everything at a sort of face value, and not make it into the kind of exciting scene that it could be if it was filmed in a certain way. If if you got really up there with the camera and was moving it around, if he was adding additional music or sound cues to cue us into how we should feel, he takes all of that away from us. He locks the camera down from just Jeffrey's POV, and by shooting it from the POV, you're supposed to be viewing it from his character's perspective. You're kind of getting his view of things, and he's forcing you to watch it as if you're the one hidden in the closet. And it's such a brilliant way to film it, because it makes you, the audience member, want to, well, I guess you could do what Jeffrey does and stay hidden within the closet in order to not get caught. But we're in the audience, not literally in the closet. But as the audience member, you want to throw open the closet and stop what's going on, but you can't. Right. And that's what makes the scene so unsettling, I think, is that you're just watching it from that closet POV, unable to stop what's going on.
Just like Jeffrey. Because remember, Dorothy says to Jeffrey when Frank comes and knocks on the door, she says, "Get in the closet, don't say a word or I'll kill you." She says you have to not say a word. It's very specific, because she knows you're going to want to say a word. Number one, she's probably saving his life. But number two, she's saying, whatever this guy's about to do to me, do not interfere. And we as the audience, I think you're completely right about that. Lynch constructs this in a way where the audience is forced to be a voyeur of sorts, and is also wants to not be one. It wants to change what's happening. And I think that is a brilliant way of doing it, because it does put you directly in Jeffrey's perspective. But like you said, at the same time, it's very stark. It's that wide master is from like the closet POV, basically. You just see the two of them on the floor in this wide master 2-shot, and everything happens, and it's not too gratuitous in that way. But you still feel everything that I think Lynch wants you to feel. Oh, it's very disturbing, but it's also very powerful, and it gets Jeffrey to, I think, sort of wake up out of his, not dream, but out of his sort of young kind of perspective of what life is. Yeah,
it takes the movie from like this kind of Scooby-Doo investigation of let me open this, sneak through the door, and now I'm hiding in the closet. Ooh, this is kind of fun.
Right. Well, he's very excited.
The moment that this happens and he watches it, everything changes, and it all connects back to that theme of seeing something that was always hidden, of nobody heard or saw what went on in this apartment, and now we and Jeffrey are the only ones seeing it. And we now finally the audience is the one seeing something that was always hidden. I definitely can understand Roger Ebert and some of the critics saying this was exploitative, but I think it's so clear that Lynch was not portraying this as something to, be excited, interested about. I think he knew that this was dark, disturbing, repulsive, vulgar, and he was trying to put you in Jeffrey's position of being trapped, unable to help.
Trapped with seeing how part of the world really is.
Yeah, I don't think this was meant to like titillate at all.
No, and what's cool to me is that Lynch even wrote in that line right before this moment. I believe I think it was just before this first Dorothy's apartment scene, where Sandy, Laura Dern's character, Sandy says to Jeffrey, "Are you a pervert or a detective?" Yeah. Right, and then he says, "Well, that's for me to know and you to find out." But really, he doesn't know.
He's such a dork.
He's a dork. And he is kind of both of those things, right? Because he just doesn't have himself quite figured out yet. He's intrigued by this, and it's almost like the pursuit of something that he finds to be important because it's hidden, and he's the detective figuring it out. He's James Bond. I mean, who wouldn't want to be that? That's cool. That's invigorating. It's amazing feeling for someone to discover something like that when you're young. But then, like you said, it turns into something completely different, and it does turn into something resembling pornography for him. Not just, this whole idea of dealing with someone else's, going into someone else's house and taking a peek into the window of someone else's life, their personal life, their woes and their struggles. He does end up sleeping with her, probably a couple times, and she's in the most vulnerable position a person could possibly be in. And in that regard, it definitely is some sort of pornography for him, I feel, because it's so easy and simple, and he's really taking advantage of a very vulnerable person, which is kind of like switching a computer on and watching pornography.
Yeah, that is the interesting kind of flip to the scene, is we're seeing, what happens to this woman from this creep, and then he leaves, and then Jeffrey becomes a part of that scene when I forget how.
Yeah, like a coat hanger falls or something.
Okay. Then the two of them get to have a scene together, and that's really fascinating because this scene could have ended with him like that happening, and then him just waiting for her to go away and him leaving and saying, "I saw this." But to have him slowly insert himself into the story that way, I think is really interesting. So then I had a couple questions for you that I want to talk about with this scene. Yeah. So she discovers him. She then threatens him because she sees him as a threat. I mean, this guy did break into her apartment. Come on, that's kind of threatening behavior. That is literally a crime. Jeffrey is a criminal. He broke into this woman's apartment. He's not as bad a criminal as Frank. But he is. Yeah,
it's close though, isn't it? It's hard. It's a toss of a coin.
Right. So my question is then, why does she immediately pivot to then attempting to seduce Jeffrey? She sees him as a threat to her. She threatens him back, and then she attempts to sort of seduce him.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there is the reason that Lynch does this, creates these emotional beats with Dorothy here, is I think to just highlight the tragedy. This is like a Shakespearean tragic character here, this Dorothy. She is caught in an untenable situation, right? Frank has her, basically kidnaps her as some sort of sex slave and uses as collateral her husband and little son, right? So she is in an absolutely horrendous position, basically going insane, losing her mind, losing her capacity to think clearly, and so on. And I think that that's sort of the logical explanation, is that she's just sort of losing her mind and in a general way. But again, this is the tragedy of why we care about the character, why the stakes are so high for this character, I think, with this decision to first act as I think most of us would, to threaten him, right? And say, hey, defense, right? Self-preservation mode. Get out of, well, she doesn't say get out of my apartment, but get out of the closet. What are you doing? What do you know? What did you hear? Right? All those kind of basic sort of interrogations. But then I think there's a trigger for her. And this is why it's so tragic to me. I think that she's just this, she's so used and powerless and helpless. We don't know how long she's been kidnapped by Frank or being extorted by Frank, how long she's kidnapped her family. He's kidnapped her family. But it's been long enough where she feels like she's just barely human anymore, like I said before. And so what you get is this moment where she's the one holding the knife. She's the one with the power. She has control for the first time in possibly a very long time. She's been so belittled and neutered by Frank that, and this is so sad, but once she has that element of power back in her hands, literally with the knife, she can do what she wants with this guy in the same way that Frank does what he wants with her. She even mimics some things that Frank says. Like Frank says, "Don't look at me." She says, "Don't touch me or I'll kill you." Right? While Frank says, don't look at me. Don't look at me. Right? And he punches her for doing that. And she threatens Jeffrey and says, "Don't touch me or I'll kill you." So there's a sort of cycle of abuse, cycle of violence, cycle of insanity that's being insinuated here. And it's so striking. It's so sad. And I really think that's the gist of it. It makes you feel the sympathy and the gravity and the graveness of what's happening to this character. And I think that directly translates onto Jeffrey. And Jeffrey feels the tragedy of it. he's starting to understand because he just watched what happened to her. And then he sees with his own two eyes and hears with his ears that what she's saying to him. And he sees the connection to Frank. So there's a little bit of cycle of violence happening here, cycle of abuse. And that, I think, gets the narrative going because we need sympathy. We need sympathy for this character big time, or Jeffrey's motivations don't make any sense.
This is my favorite part of the conversation, not because of the scene we're talking about, God forbid, but because your take, I totally understand, even while I have a different take on what's going on. So what I see as Dorothy seducing Jeffrey, I'm seeing her use one of the only cards she's able to use in getting these men to leave her alone. Because when Frank comes over, she knows that she sleeps with him, and then he leaves her alone, at least for the night. And when Jeffrey similarly hasn't, broken into her apartment, I think she sees this as one of her only plays to get him to leave. She's like, this is what he wants. I'm going to give it to him, and he's going to leave me alone. So that's kind of the way I saw her, what she was doing with Jeffrey. I don't know if that's something you kind of got out of that.
Yeah, possibly. I didn't think about her being, hey, this is the most expedient way for me to get him to leave, per se. I don't know if she's thinking that much, or at least in my mind, I don't see her as that much of a thinking agent. I think she's a very, very much a feeling agent in the whole movie, except for literally the very last shot. So I didn't quite think that. It does make sense if she is thinking enough that much. But I think that she's instead of like, how do I solve the problem mode, I think she's in survival mode.
Right.
And
more acting out of desperation.
Yeah, exactly. And she's lucid enough to be able to, not kill herself and everyone around her just out of insanity with that knife. But she's also disoriented, I think, enough to just start acting impulsively, right? Like she's been used for so long that she's just going to do that because that's all that her mind is able to process at the moment. And then all of a sudden you have this new element, this new character, this new person in her life, and so all she knows of love, so to speak, at this point, or what Frank calls love, which we'll talk about soon, is this. And so she's doing that. It's like she's lost all sense of what love is. It's like that it's dulled. That emotion in her, that conception for her it's completely dulled and jaded into this psychotic performance, which is what Frank has inadvertently taught her.
Well, yeah, it's become very transactional, the act.
Yes.
For her is that she has to service Frank in order to see her children.
Right. And I think it even harkens to what would be coming up pretty soon, which was the scene where he actually does show Dorothy and Jeffrey sleeping together. Notice she says something like, "You put your disease in me." It's unclear. She's not quite sure how to feel, but I think that goes along with the transactional nature, like you're saying. I lay down for you, you put your disease in me, and then we go on our way and just pretend like there's nothing consequential about it. That's just how much Frank, I think, has obliterated the entire concept of love for her.
I think it's the best line in the movie.
Which one?
He put his disease in me. And I had that on my list to ask later. So since you brought it up, I want to talk about it, because what I said is we talked about a couple lines here. We talked about the title of the movie, Blue Velvet. Hard to say if you could call it really the line of this movie, because it borrows from the song. So it's not like David Lynch really wrote that line to begin with. Then there's what I said earlier was I'm seeing something that was always hidden, which I think is a great theme for the movie. but it's not really Lynchian. It doesn't really tell you too much about his style, maybe of filming or of writing. But the line he put his disease in me is the Lynchian line of Blue Velvet, and every time I hear it, it shocks me because it's such a poetic way of saying something. I just wanted to get your take on what it means.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's so many interpretations of what that could be, but it's a little unclear to me only because she does keep mistaking Jeffrey to be Don, her husband. I think she continues to call him Don, I believe, even when they're sleeping together. But then she also says, Jeffrey, my secret love, right? I need you. You're saving me in a sense. So at first I was thinking, oh, you put this disease in me. You know, maybe she's talking about her regret of having her own child because she's hearkening back to when she was sleeping with her husband and they conceived her child. And now the child has been used as, you know, property that has been stolen for collateral, right? So, and leverage. And I was thinking that just the tragedy of that, of having your child being used as leverage in this way, ransom, basically. And so I kind of think it's that, if she kind of thinks that Jeffrey's Don. But if she thinks that Jeffrey is Jeffrey, then I really do think that you nailed it with the transaction argument. I think that it's like she can't love anymore the way that she always had with her husband. And again, Frank has just completely destroyed her conception of it. I think that any kind of lovemaking ultimately, in her eyes, at that moment in the film, ultimately amounts to, you are just giving me your disease, you know? Because I think that whatever Frank has could be a disease, quite literally. It's not even clear that Frank actually is able to even ejaculate or, you know, finish his sexual release the way that most people do. But I do think that there's this sort of metaphorical disease of his behavior influencing her or corrupting her sexually, whether the sex is kosher or not in some kind of way. So I do think that she's sort of using it metaphorically as well as literally, that we engaged in this disease making, not just love making. Because again, the word love doesn't make sense to her anymore. It's more like disease making. I think that's what I would say about it. What do you think? What do you think she means?
I think she does feel a sort of, maybe if not love, but I think she feels an attachment because she is saying, Jeffrey, hold me, before she says that, I believe, in the movie. So I think she's pretty certain. I don't think she's in such a dissociative state that through the entire runtime she believes he's another man. I think she knows it's Jeffrey. But I think that line is just giving her, he gave her something she doesn't want, and that is an attachment to another man, a dependency on someone that she now needs, because she was kind of dealing with this all on her own before, and that's terrible too. And now she is Jeffrey, but Jeffrey's not always there, and now she sees herself craving him and needing him. He's giving her something that she wants, that she hasn't had in a long time, which is just someone treating her with, I don't know, I wouldn't even say respect or dignity, because he really doesn't, but only by her own request. So I kind of see it as, by what her and Jeffrey do together, she is given that attachment that she does not want, but now needs.
It's very, very tragic. And I think it needs to be to propel the story forward. The sympathy that we feel as an audience, perhaps empathy, but definitely sympathy. And we need that. And Jeffrey needs that. We need to understand what he's feeling in order for him to start taking on Frank. and be the, I guess you could say, man that he's becoming in order to understand the proper values of love so that he can love Sandy by the end of the story. I would like to segue into Frank. Frank is an essential component of this movie. He's a fun component of this movie. He's terrifying, right? He's very disturbing. He's disturbed, but there's so much that revolves around him that I just want to know your general take on Frank, because in our pre-chat we were talking a little bit about it. You had some specific views and some specific kind of interpretations of the Frank character. So I just wanted to ask you generally off the bat, who is Frank? What does he represent, if it's anything metaphoric? And what does Frank give to the movie in terms of meaning?
Yeah, you're saying in your intro, and I think this is an important distinction to make, that he's funny. And you wouldn't think that, because what did we just describe? We described he kidnapped a woman's husband and her child, and he now rapes this woman on a regular basis.
Yeah,
he's
and that's the first time we see him. That's his exposition.
Yeah, so he's a monster.
Yes.
And yet he does say and do funny things throughout this movie. They don't endear you to him at all. You never really are laughing at anything he does, even if they might be tonally funny. I think it's just kind of maybe that classic David Lynch playing with tone of saying, oh, we watched something dark and disturbing. Now we're going to cut to something a little goofier and sillier. And there are times in Blue Velvet where maybe I don't think it's the best decision to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. But that is an interesting way to portray him, as sometimes saying funny things. Maybe some of it is the line deliveries of Dennis Hopper.
Yeah.
But some of the lines too are funny, where he's like, what do you want to drink? Heineken? Fuck that shit. Pabst Blue Ribbon.
Yes.
A classic Blue Velvet line. Very surreal scene where he's very enthusiastic about one beer over another, even though they're both kind of standard bar offerings.
Right.
Yeah, it is interesting that he decides to play some of his lines in that sort of tonal shift.
It's definitely tonal. There are a couple lines, just to jump in for a second, that are just objectively funny and there's no other purpose. Sort of like when they're at Ben's house, that drug dealer guy, and when they're gonna leave, he says, "Anyone else want to come? You?" And he points to these just like crazy, weird looking people on the other end of the room who are just very static and they're not going anywhere. And he just kind of shrugs and says, "All right." So when he says you, and then the camera cuts to those people that are just not making any expressions, and it's funny. Like, there's no other reason for that other than just this guy has some sort of exuberance to him. He's eccentric. But yes, go on.
Yeah. So what I think Frank is kind of that self-repressed American male who then uses all of that bubbling resentment inside to lash out at others with violence. I think it's a very unfortunately common archetype that we can even see in our own lives, or at least maybe on the news and stuff from day to day. But we see it in this movie, and I think we see it in maybe a couple David Lynch movies and projects.
Yeah, that's interesting. You specifically mentioned in our pre-chat at some point repressed homosexuality.
Yeah.
Do you think you could expand on that for us a little bit? Because I did not think that, especially with the first couple times I watched the movie before you had told me about it. What gave you that idea?
So many actions that Frank and so many things he says. Yeah. The actions and words of Frank were leading up to a man who was repressing something within himself and lashing out at others. And I thought, when I finally finished the end of the movie, I took all of these individual things, and when I added them up, I saw him as like a repressed having a repressed homoerotic attachment to Jeffrey and maybe even Ben, the guy who's singing in the apartment. And I think that's a reading people can, it's kind of a lazy reading sometimes of movies. And I'll admit that myself, that you could do this with any movie and say, oh, well, this character is actually in love with this character, and that's why they do this, and that. And you know, you can give your reasons and stuff, but I feel like there's a lot of stuff in here, and I'll kind of list them out now. So I think when we go on the joyride, Frank brings Jeffrey along, and he's going to intimidate him, and he's going to show off how much power he has to his friend Ben and whoever else is in there. That's where Dorothy's son is. And you really see in the scene that Frank wants to be like Ben. And he's like, oh, you're such a suave motherfucker. Oh, you're so suave, Ben. You're so suave. Frank is not suave. He is very on edge. He is very abrasive. He's the opposite of Ben.
Right.
But now Ben's the only character in the movie that Frank speaks positively of. He doesn't like his cronies, you know, his bumbling idiot gang that he deals with. He's always hitting them and insulting them. Definitely doesn't like Jeffrey. Definitely has no respect for Dorothy and her family. And he's just kind of working with the policeman as an equal. He doesn't really feel one way or the other about him. But it's with Ben that he's giving these compliments and saying he's great and all these kind of things. The desire not to be looked at or seen by Dorothy is something interesting, because he's so many times throughout this movie, you hear him say, "Don't you fucking look at me." Yeah. And there's something within him that doesn't want to be perceived, that doesn't want to be seen by the only real woman character in this movie. And even when he does what he does to her, you were saying earlier, he has problems getting off. He can't even really accomplish what he's doing or do what he's doing without his chemical stimulants. It's one of the defining images of the movie, is him holding up that mask to himself and putting himself in sort of some altered mental state, because he needs to be in an entirely different state of mind to even do it to this woman. And also part of that I definitely don't have the intelligence to explore is that he goes into some sort of incestual role play scenario where he's saying, "Mommy, mommy, baby wants to fuck." He definitely seems traumatized, definitely some childhood trauma going on. I'm going to leave it at that. I don't care to discuss it. I think just mentioning it is maybe enough for this podcast and for listeners. And if you want to listen to more of that, then go listen to.
I've got a take on it. I've got a take on it. I'll tell you next. Yeah.
Okay. I'll wrap it up. So there's that. Yeah. Now, when he finally brings Jeffrey along with him to that place, he says a couple things about it. He says, "I can make him do anything I please." That shows, like, on the surface level, it's showing he has a power over him, and he's, a criminal, making him do whatever he wants. I think it's also very suggestive. Anything I want. Well, what's anything? Maybe he wants something else with him. He says later, another great Lynchian line in Lynch movie, where it tracks in on him. He goes, "I'll fuck anything that moves."
Yes.
Well, what's something that moves? Jeffrey moves. And why wouldn't he just say, like, I'll fuck, any woman I want. I'll fuck. He says, "I'll fuck anything that moves."
Yeah.
So maybe not even like a homoerotic reading, maybe just a sort of like a pansexual reading or something like that. He's not going to discriminate one way or the other. But it's definitely something he wants to hide about himself, and hiding that makes life difficult for him and stresses him out. Then when that happens, he wants Ben to sing that song, not Enter Sandman, Metallica song. What's the song? Mr. Sandman.
Yeah, it's called "In Dreams."
In Dreams,
but they're referring to the first line, which is the candy-colored clown.
Yeah,
and the Sandman or something like that. Yeah,
So
In Dreams by
wants,
Roy Orbison. Yeah.
yes, he wants Ben to sing the song, and you see Frank start to dissociate, and he's kind of going into his own dream state, and he relaxes for a bit, and you see him become softer. And the second he starts to become softer, he starts to realize it, and he immediately snaps himself out of it, forces Ben to stop the song, and he's like, everybody get out of here.
Yes.
And I think this is such one of the great directorial decisions of this movie too. It's very jarring in tone and visual, everything. He does his "I'll fuck anything that moves," and then he just disappears from a solid frame that holds on where he was. So he doesn't walk out of the frame. It doesn't cut to him in a different location or anything like that. He just jump cuts to Frank disappeared in that frame. And then I think there's some sound effects in the background of like the car peeling out or something like that. And I think that's him literally snapping back to reality out of his mental state of softening up, of thinking these thoughts about Jeffrey, about Ben, about his own dreams. He snaps himself out of there. And then later, it's almost too on the nose for this reading, but he puts lipstick either on himself or on Jeffrey. I forget who he does it to first. But then he kisses him, and it's definitely intimidating. Like you can read it as he's intimidating him, saying like, "Oh, I can make you do anything I want. Isn't this embarrassing for you? Right. You're so
Make
embarrassed. I'm not. Yeah, right. I'm definitely not embarrassed by this because I'm definitely not attracted to you, and I don't want to kiss you. This is just a joke, and the joke's on you." Right. And then in the background, what's playing? He's playing "In Dreams" again, and then he sings it to him. And the lyrics, "In dreams I walk with you, only in dreams." And I think that's his subconscious or something connecting that this is something he's only going to do in his dreams. He's never going to make this a reality for himself. Right. And that's why he has to go into these dissociative states. He has to lash out with violence in order to keep this part of his life only in his dreams. And then the final thing is later in the movie, there's a line that I didn't write down the first time. I wrote all that stuff down the last time I watched the movie, but with this rewatch, I added this last one. When he finally goes back to the apartment for the final time, he's looking for Jeffrey, and he goes, "Here, pretty, pretty." Yeah. And of course, that's kind of like a play on like a "here, kitty, kitty," or like he's infantilizing him, like, "Oh, I'm stronger than you. You're just like a pretty, girl," and whatever. It's him doing this again. He's calling the Jeffrey pretty. So I think maybe all individually, these would not be enough to add up to the portrait I give of Frank, of saying he's repressing these homoerotic thoughts about other men, and it's causing him to be violent and act the way he does. But I think when I add up all of these back to back, that stood out to me. So what do you think?
I think that it's a very interesting take. I think it makes perfect sense, just logically, especially after you laid all of that stuff out. And I was just talking about my impressions before you had told me that. When I rewatched it after you had told me that, I said to myself, this definitely makes sense as applying it into the movie as a guesswork for the sort of the operating system, so to speak, or an explanation of what's happening in Frank in order to render all of these things, the lines, the behaviors, the actions, everything. Like you said, there's a lot of stuff in there for Frank that would justify that interpretation, which is really cool, because I kind of watched the movie with a new eye, or the character with a new eye. However, I think he might be repressing homoerotic thoughts for sure. But I couldn't help but find, I'm not married to either one, but it doesn't seem to me that it has to be that. To me, I had this idea where maybe Frank is just sort of, instead of necessarily repressed homosexuality, just repressed sexuality in general. You know, he's a repressed sexual. I think that whatever Frank has going on, that is preventing whatever pathological or whatever it is that's happening in him, is preventing him from even understanding at all what love or intimacy or appreciation for a person even is. So my take on Frank is that he's just, regardless of the reason, he's entirely inauthentic. And at the end, I'm going to wrap this in, connect it to my take. He's completely inauthentic. He's totally guarded. He curses so much, right? He curses in ways that no one even curses. He's
fuck.
Right. I mean, people say you fuck, but he says to Ben when he goes to visit him, he says, "How the shit are you?" I have never in my life heard someone say, "How the shit are you?" Right? And so if you watch the movie again, you listen to what he's saying, it's so clearly like overcompensation. It's filling in these cracks in his psyche where he doesn't understand. He's filling them in with way too much mortar, right? And he's trying to give off airs of a person that's well learned in the likes of love and how to be cool and intimate and to get someone to like you and all these kinds of things. He's totally over the edge in trying to compensate for his faults there. So regardless of whether he's a homosexual, I think that he's definitely repressed from being able to, express himself in that way. And he's just tortured himself.
He's just even repressed himself from the idea of exploring it. Maybe he doesn't know one way or the other, but there are things that he would never even let himself do at all, or think about.
For sure. And I think he does what he does because he's good at what he does for business. He's very good at crime. He's very good at being that cold, monstrous agent that needs to do what they need to do in order to control and manipulate other people in order to do the crimes that he needs to do and accomplish the drug trade, accomplish the murder, whatever it is that he needs to do. So that is his gift in that regard, right? But his curse is that he basically doesn't know how to emote, right? At all, I think. And especially love. And I think that's why he wants to operate while listening to music, right? Like in Dreams and, Blue Velvet. He's moved by Blue Velvet in that cabaret scene. I think that he needs the music to dictate to him how to even perceive what these emotional things even are, The only thing he does emotional in the movie is cry, but I don't think he's crying because of the beauty of the song. I think it's the same reason he gets upset in that Ben scene when Ben sings in lip syncs in Dreams, like you were talking about. I think it's because there are things that make him realize that he has no conception at all of love and emotional things. And I think that saddens him. I think that's the only thing he can feel is, anger and sadness because of that component of himself, because he cannot even conceive of what love even is. And then you have this other character, this Jeffrey, whether he's attracted to him or not. I think you have a character like that can't love. He sees Jeffrey and he sees the connection that Dorothy has, even if it's just, something ordinary, or even if he believes the lie of, oh, he's just a neighbor and a friend that I was talking to. He keeps saying, hey, neighbor, hey, pretty. He's saying things that he thinks are the components of love as associated with Dorothy, right? He tries to love Dorothy. I think that the beating her up and violating her and all this stuff, that's the closest thing that he knows to love. He knows what people generally do, so he touches her in certain places. He says things that he thinks are stimulating, but he doesn't actually feel the intimacy. He doesn't feel the personal connection, right? So he needs songs to dictate to him what it even is. And I think the In Dreams, like you said, is very personal to him. because the only thing that he can do is dream, perhaps, about knowing how to love someone. And then, of course, I think Lynch is including this in the character because then you have these two characters that are the perfect antithesis of Frank, right? They're immersing themselves in effusive love. And that's what we see happening. That's basically my take on Frank. And the mommy and daddy, thing. I also think that he takes control just impulsively to try and to attempt to pretend that to role play basically as someone that can love, but even that he's bad at. But I also think that the mommy and daddy and the baby thing, which is extremely disturbing, but I think that ties into what Jeffrey is learning. Jeffrey is learning different things about sex that he's never learned before, different things about other people, about life, about the struggles of other people. And again, it's about this understanding the world for all of the complexity that it is, the nuance that it is. And I think that Frank taking these very typical, roles of the family, the mother, the father, the son, or whatever it is, and he's demolishing those ordinary roles right in front of Jeffrey. He doesn't know that Jeffrey's there, but Lynch is writing it in, I think, because, again, as a child, your conception of mommy, the word, daddy, the word, a child, or the other babies, it's very clear and narrow, right? But then Frank is conflating sex with all of these distortions of the family value or the definitions of what family members are. So I think that all ties into Jeffrey learning that, oh my goodness, mommy doesn't necessarily just mean mommy. Daddy doesn't necessarily just mean daddy. Sex is a lot more complicated than he even thought. And these are words that people use during sex, right? It's not necessarily in a Frank way, as in Frank, the character. These are words that people actually use. Baby. We use baby all the time. Hey, baby, what's going on? Right? And then people say mommy and daddy during sex all the time, not necessarily for as disturbing reasons as this, perhaps, but they are keywords that people use. So he just has a more psychotic and distorted version of what that is. But I do think that Lynch is writing this in because of that.
Definitely. And I think this connects to the last scene I want to talk about, because we did the first one I wanted to talk about was that first night in the apartment. The second one I wanted to talk about was the joyride, where we talked a lot about Frank. And the final one, I think, is kind of where Frank and Jeffrey converge, which is, it's kind of a whole sequence more so than a scene. But what I called it is the dance, the love, and the dream shattered. And now this takes us from starting at when Jeffrey and Sandy leave to go to this house party, and they're going to dance together to a song that does not belong at any sort of house party I've ever been to. It's just a very Lynchian inclusion, but it's there. You just kind of got to go along with it. It's the kind of decision where you have to be like, do I believe this would be playing at someone's house in a 1980s/1950s styled setting?
Right.
No, but does it work perfectly to set the mood of the scene? I think it's perfect for what he chooses it to do, to show the love blossoming between these two people. And then right after that, you get this scene of them being chased in the car. Dorothy Vallon shows up, and then there's kind of a confrontation between all of them as they struggle to get her some help. There's a lot that goes on, but it's kind of like a quick summation of the movie as a whole, because you're starting out where we kind of started the movie out with these two kids and, interested in each other, interested in living a normal life together with maybe a little bit of excitement. So their early excitement was, let's break into this apartment and find out what kind of stuff's going on. This time it's, let's go to this house party, and it might not be at the school, so that makes it a little more exciting and interesting. We're going to be in someone's basement. So they dance, they kiss, I think this is the first time they confess their love for each other in the movie. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so they've confessed their love for each other and they leave. And then we get a very Americana car chase and plotting of like, hey, you stole my girl. So we're doing like this little exercise of conflict that's very small scale compared to the large scale. And some people might say like, oh, this doesn't, I didn't get why this was here. This doesn't fit with like the rest of the movie. But I really think it is like a nice little microcosm of the kind of small problems. And then we've already kind of seen Kyle MacLachlan, Jeffrey, seeing something that was always hidden. Sandy's about to, but this is Mike's chance to see it. Mike is Sandy's ex, and Jeffrey has now stolen, like, if there is such a thing, Mike's girl, he would say.
Yeah.
So Mike challenges him to a fight, and then before they can really get into it, Dorothy Valens shows up completely nude and beaten and bruised. So this interrupts that entire scene that's going on. And now even Mike, the high school quarterback, football player, whatever archetype he's supposed to be, the all-American quarterback with the cheerleader girlfriend or whoever Sandy is. Right. He's now seeing something that was always hidden, where he shows up to fight this kid. Hey, you're a punk. I'm going to, show you what for. And now he's seeing this woman on the lawn approach. And now at first he says, is this your mother? I think that's probably before maybe everybody notices that she's like nude and beaten. So we just see a woman approaching from the shadows. That kind of ties into maybe the familiar stuff you were saying before, but it's probably just because they were outside his house. But so we set up that they love each other and they're having this perfect night out together. Now we're setting up the seeing something that was always hidden when Dorothy comes out. Then it segs into what we talked about earlier. He put his disease in me. Sandy puts 2 and 2 together and breaks down in a really great expression that has been memed. And I have seen someone use the image of Sandy's reaction to that line as their Letterboxd profile picture.
Oh my goodness.
It's a really great expression.
Iconic. Yeah. Well, Laura Dern is just killer at doing stuff like that.
She's the best.
And
she really I think she really grounds this movie. I think we were about to talk about this on a phone call while we were just setting up for the podcast. And then I was like, wait, I want to talk about this on the show. But I want to say that she grounds this movie like no one else and has the most naturalistic performance of anyone.
For sure.
And I think that is probably more her doing than Lynch. I think Lynch has a tendency to fit archetypes and to make people exaggerate. Like him and Dennis Hopper working together is probably a 2 and 2 of people over exaggerating things.
Yeah.
Which is, good for this movie because it kind of succeeds at what it attempts to do.
More so Lynch, because Hopper said that he brought it to a certain place where he thought it was even too much. And then Lynch said to him, oh, you're not even halfway there. So that part of it was Lynch's influence for sure. The over-the-topness,
Yeah, so that's why I wondered sometimes if some of his antics were on purpose or not. But, I guess they were. But, so then this scene is great because it's really one of the most important scenes in Blue Velvet. It's the moment that Sandy's dream and idea of like the American dream is basically ruined because she thought she had this nice new boy who was going to, treat her right and she was going to fall in love with him and have the white picket fence in the house and the future together. Now what she's finding out is that he's capable of doing the things that the guy they're trying to stop is doing. Like he's getting involved in the crimes and the criminals and all this kind of stuff when she was telling him to leave earlier and he couldn't leave it alone. He got sucked into it because he couldn't help himself. And now she has to deal with it. She has to feel the way she's feeling because of Jeffrey and his decisions and the things he couldn't help about himself.
It's a very powerful part of the movie. And just to go back very quickly to what you said, this striking image of Isabella Rossellini appearing nude and bruised and beaten up and just completely halting Mike, the ex-boyfriend's nonsense, right? Completely halting it and basically just rendering him totally useless, as as a human being. Just he if you even remember, he was just like, oh, I'm like, he's even apologizing, dribbling out, and I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Who is that? What, he's just totally taken aback by it. It blows him away. So, and then Jeffrey, Kyle MacLachlan, is just kind of taking her into the car and everything. He thinks nothing of it at this point because he's this sort of evolved form of Mike, where Mike hasn't experienced anything yet because he's still in high school, right? So I thought that was just a really cool, again, contrast between different types of characters that really illustrate what I think Lynch is accomplishing here with the story. Mike is sort of like, not he doesn't have the personality of Jeffrey, but Mike is a sort of doppelganger of Jeffrey before all of this happened. The innocent, sort of very small world, like you said, it's a, archetype kind of a character that hasn't experienced anything beyond just that archetype. So I love the difference between the before and the after there.
So one of the things I was kind of talking about there was the kind of convergence of Jeffrey and Frank, where now Jeffrey's taking the role of sort of doing what Frank was doing to Dorothy, but in a consensual way now, because she's accepting it and embracing it. So now one of the things she does is that she begs Jeffrey to hit her. And he, this was something that Frank did in an unconsensual way before, he was going about everything. Obviously, he was beating her and she doesn't want him to. But now she begs Jeffrey, who she's having this consensual relationship with, to beat her. And at first, he refuses. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. And then after enough begging, he does. So what do you why do you think he agrees to do it?
Well, first of all, I think what we're saying here is at some point in Frank's life, Frank was like Jeffrey. Frank, everyone has a loss of innocence moment in their life, or year, or phase, right? So I think there's this idea that I think Lynch is installing here that says something along the lines of, Frank is a monster, but he started out not being a monster. He started out being, let's say, just a kid that was learning from other monsters, or he was mistreated somehow in his own way, right? No one's born a monster, right? Monsters are created, this kind of a thing. So I think just showing that little bit of persuasion on Dorothy's part toward Jeffrey to do this to me, do this to me, do this to me, right? And it's a situation where he can. There's no one to tell, there's no authority figure there to tell him that you can't, like there is in all his other, all of his other parts of life. Jeffrey, his father or his mother or Detective Williams or, the law, whatever it is. He's just in this adult face-to-face situation that's totally outside of the norm. And I think Lynch is saying something here about life is going to be filled with these kinds of challenges and these kinds of scenarios, things that we're completely unprepared for. But in this case, he does take that step to give Dorothy what she's looking for. And I don't think he turns into a monster, but he does something that can be viewed as being temporarily monstrous. And it gives me this notion that any of us could become a monster at any time if we don't fight it with, let's say, Sandy's idea of love. The Robins. We all have the capacity to become Frank. The extreme. Frank is the extreme. It's the end of the scale of what we could become. if we don't love, if we don't find, I think it's a very romantic idea. So I do think that Sandy understands the humanity, and she is learning about life in the same way that Jeffrey is, right? So Jeffrey is to seeing Dorothy get beaten, Sandy seeing him resemble monstrous behavior, right?
Yeah.
It's a similar learning experience. It also, again, it ties into my take that this is what this movie is ultimately about. It's about seeing the world for what it is and contending with that and being okay and accepting that as the standard of just what your life will be. This is the world we live in. It's strange, isn't it? It's a strange world. It's a complicated world. The characters keep repeating this. So, but I do think that she's a very optimistic character. She believes in Jeffrey for every reason that Frank does not have in him to be able to love someone. It's the forgiveness. It's the kindness. It's the ability to see the humanity in the situation, the context in the situation, right? And to break out of the mold of conventional thinking and conventional wisdom about certain things. Like, my boyfriend has cheated on me, I should leave him. It's more complicated and layered and textured than that. And I think that that character understands that. And I think that Lynch understands that very well. And that's why Lynch wrote it in. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the Sandy character really is the key to the movie, because if you just had the scenes of Jeffrey kind of becoming Frank in a way, it would just be a totally different movie. It'd be very pessimistic of saying all men are just giving in to these urges and they're acting like animals and they can't help it. And this is the way the world is. But with Sandy's involvement in it, what you're seeing is that she's kind of discovering these same things at the same time he is. And the fact that they're going through it together, I think they're able to share together that kind of knowledge at the same time, the seeing something that was always hidden. And so you were saying she's optimistic, maybe to a fault. Maybe she shouldn't forgive Jeffrey. There could be different reasons why she would or would not, but she ultimately decides to. And I think what you're seeing is just a love and understanding. You see two characters that actually do love each other because they're able to go through. So they didn't understand the world was screwed up before, but they both do now. And that's how they're able to navigate it together, is through love. Because if either of them didn't know, it'd be a lopsided relationship. You'd have Jeffrey with all this knowledge and her unable to keep up. And maybe he would, keep doing this thing and she'd never find out. And it would, eat away at him, or she'd figure it out, but a lot later, and it'd cause conflict. But the fact that it all comes together at the same time, right place, right time, or maybe wrong place, wrong time. But
but regardless, it did fall into place. And that is kind of how life is. It kicks your ass, but you end up learning probably so much more in the most difficult parts of life than you do any others. And that's a tough pill to swallow, but it's just the way the world is. And it's strange, and yet true. So I think this is going to segue us into the final image and the closing sequence. I'm going to summarize it quickly, and I'd love to get your view on it, because I think that even the things that we're talking about now will, dovetail nicely into our thoughts on the closing. So after Jeffrey and Sandy kiss at the climax of Dorothy's apartment after Frank is killed, we hear that ethereal song again, the synth and the strings, and with this soft melody being sung. The song is called Mysteries of Love, and the lyrics were written by David Lynch. So it doesn't get more Lynchian than that, folks. The words are, "Kiss forever in the darkness," while they're kissing, of course. "And the mysteries of love come clear and dance in love, in you, in me." and show that we have love. So it's just gushingly romantic. And then we zoom out from an extreme close-up of Jeffrey's ear. And we see that he's peacefully lounging in the backyard of his parents' house. He closes his eyes and he's listening to the birds sing. His eyes open and he looks up and sees a bird in the tree above him. And he kind of smiles. Sandy calls Jeffrey in for lunch. He's on his way in the house, and he says hi to his father and Detective Williams. Jeffrey's aunt notices that there's a bird in the kitchen windowsill. It's the same bird, presumably, that he saw when he woke up, Jeffrey. And it's caught a bug in its mouth. I guess the same bug that we saw underneath the surface of the lawn in the opening. And Jeffrey says to Sandy, maybe the robins are here, referring to the robins from her dream, which she said represent love. We have a close-up of the bird and the bug struggling in its beak, and then we crossfade into the yellow tulips in front of the white picket fence, and we hear this song, Mysteries of Love, again. Sometimes the wind blows and the mysteries of love come clear. Then we fade into a closer shot of the fireman from before in the beginning of the movie, waving and riding in slow motion on the fire truck. Then we fade into the red roses in front of the white fence, basically the reverse order of the opening of the film. Then it fades into a slow motion shot. This is quite astonishing of a shot of Donnie, who's Dorothy's young son, wearing that music note propeller hat and walking with his arms spread apart and pretending to fly. He's approaching his mother, and his mother is smiling. Dorothy is clean cut for the first time in the movie, basically, and she's on a park bench. And he leaps into her arms, and she embraces him. She's grateful and peaceful. We hear Dorothy's cover of Blue Velvet, and I still can see blue velvet through my tears. We tilt up and pan up from Dorothy and her son and away from them, and there's a out of focus treetops in the background, and we pass through them, and it gives way to a clear blue sky, just like the beginning. So what are your immediate thoughts on this sequence, Stonehouse, and what do you think of that final image of that panning all the way up to the blue sky?
Really quick, I just wanted to, I don't remember if I've ever talked about my John Waters connection before, because you said you wanted to hear it, and I was like, oh, I can't end the episode without saying it.
All right, let's do it quickly.
It was at the house party when they first get there. I think everybody just kind of sitting in these very fancy designed furniture and their fancy clothes, but everything's kind of dirty and decaying at the same time. You have goofy dialogue, you have old rock and roll playing in the background, and I think it's just a very audio-visual connection, kind of those kind of movies, that kind of mixing of high society and trash put together to make a kind of comedic effect.
Yeah, especially Hairspray, which is ironic because that's, his most tame movie, his only tame movie, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. But so then, with these images at the ending, it is, I think I mentioned this with the opening image, that it would come back in the end and we'd have a different perspective. And it's a good sequence because you know that Jeffrey and Sandy have the same perspective as you now. You went along on this ride with them and discovered the things at the exact same time as them, because we saw Jeffrey seeing the first night in Dorothy's apartment. We saw Sandy's reaction to Jeffrey with Dorothy. We got to see them go through that and come out at the other side, and they've made it. The end, there are good and bad things about it. The bird really annoys me. I really think they just probably could have filmed a regular bird maybe, and they didn't have to put it on the windowsill. They didn't have to. The symbolism of eating the bug is good because we were talking about the bugs earlier in the movie, but you could probably find some B-roll of a robin with a worm in its mouth. Come on, we don't need this puppet in here, because my only thought when I see it is, that's a puppet. But it does
fair.
serve this whole ending scene serves that love overcoming evil and darkness theme. So they've discovered something that was always hidden, this dark crime underneath. But now with that knowledge, they can work through it together. And you're talking about the lines about the robins coming. This was connecting to a monologue that Sandy had earlier where she tells a dream, I think it was she had. She was like, I'm paraphrasing just because I don't really care. But she's like, there's a lot of darkness. And then there was a robin, and then there was light and love, something like that. So now we're just making her dream reality, but in a different way. So originally at the start of her movie, what's Sandy's dream? It's probably to marry her quarterback boyfriend and have a house and kids and the white picket fence and the flowers. What's her dream now? It's just for love to overcome the darkness.
Right.
I mean, that's what her dream was. That was her dream about the Rob. So yeah, her dream goes through 3 phases. It's marrying, having a normal American life. Then it's this Robin dream that she talks about that she literally had. Then it's not dealing with any of the darkness anymore. And we know it's there. We're going to try to avoid it. And because we know it's there,
we'll do our best.
We're going to keep it in an arm. Yeah. And so that's why I keep saying that Sandy is the key to this movie, because Jeffrey is the one who gives into that darkness. He's kind of like the Anakin Skywalker of this movie, giving into the dark side. And that's what the listeners come to Speaking Cinema for, is the connecting Lynch with Star Wars.
You're not going to get that anywhere else, folks. Nowhere else.
But he's giving into that darker side that Sandy doesn't really do. But it is, I think it's so sad to see her kind of settle in this movie. I don't think it's really honorable for her to accept Jeffrey the way she is. I think she should kind of pull back and reject him even a little, to say, this isn't as bad as Mike was. What's his biggest crime? Trying to fight someone who now is dating his ex-girlfriend? Like, he's not justified in using physical violence even for that. But that's, you could compare that to what Jeffrey's doing and be like, well, on the grand scheme of things, who did a worse thing to Sandy, or to like another to Jeffrey or Sandy, between the 3 of them? But so the ending of his movie, I think it definitely works, just because he's forcing it to. He's saying, okay, well, did we not talk about Frank getting shot in the face? Or did you cover that in the recap? Because the crime stuff is really second to me to the.
Yeah, no, I started the closing sequence with, hey, Frank was just killed, and then this closing sequence started. So I think the crime, it really ties everything together, in terms of, like you said, defeating the darkness. And I think that Jeffrey does ultimately now have the tools to defeat the darkness. And I love that Lynch puts him in the closet in the same way that he, started to stumble upon the darkness in the same space. And there is something to be said about that, where there is darkness, there can be light, and redemption, of course. So I really loved that. But I have to say, I'm going to disagree with you. I was totally sold by the love story between these 2 characters, or by the love, and I didn't really see it as settling on Sandy's part. I saw it as she's already in love with him, and this just wasn't enough to break that spell, and she just merely forgives him for his sins, which everyone commits. Now, the other thing about that is, I think that Sandy, I wasn't even really sold that she should be that upset over this, because what Jeffrey did was bad. It's bad. I mean, number 1, it was consensual, but number 2 is he did all that stuff before they professed their love for each other. That's what gets me every time I watch this movie. I'm like, but I know that you're upset, Sandy, but like, This was before you started to date. Is before you were boyfriend and girlfriend. I know that you're aware that he did these things that are very disagreeable. But number one, it was before you guys were dating. It's a huge difference if they started to date. And then he went back to Dorothy's apartment and got some more action. But then
maybe I got
also,
the timelines mixed up. I thought they were together for a little while before that point.
Oh, yeah. No, he said you're a neat girl. And he tried to make a move on her. And she said, no, sorry, I can't do this. I love Mike, all that stuff. And then he does all the stuff with sort of Dorothy during that time, and I guess he's just sort of refused and giving in to the easy temptation and so on. But it's not until they profess the love for each other for the first time, which we said was during the dance. And think about it, the dance, right after the dance, was the car chase, and then Dorothy, and then her knowing that he gave her his disease, right? So none of that stuff, those bad things happened before that point. So before they professed their love. So I buy it. I don't think that she should, deny him. I don't think that she's settling. I think that they truly are in love. I think that she had to go on her own personal journey to say goodbye to Mike. And I think that he had to go on his own personal journey to again contend with the darkness that exists in life, the temptations that exist. And he is truly regretful of what he did at the end. And I think that she knows that, he knows that, and that's why they're able to build a life together.
Yeah, I think the way maybe it could work better with me is maybe if Sandy did something, not the same thing, but maybe it's just something of equal, like a transgression of any sort, to kind of say, okay, we're on the same level. We understand that we're both capable of these things, rather than only having Jeffrey be the one that transgressed, her forgiving him, her accepting him. I think maybe having both of them do that would put them more on equal footing, because the theme of the movie is that really they're both, what's the quote I keep saying that I wrote down? Seeing something that was always hidden. They've both seen something that was always hidden, but only one of them's done something that was always hidden.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And I just want to talk very quickly about ears.
Sure.
Because you're always down to talk about ears. I mean, I just wanted to say this little thing about in this closing sequence. The closing sequence starts basically, in my eyes, with his ear. It's an extreme close-up. And we see the insects eating away at Dorothy's husband's ear at the beginning of the film. This entire thing is instigated by the fact that Jeffrey discovers a severed ear. And I just couldn't help but want to talk about ears for a second, because I think that Lynch is saying something with this ear, right? It has a kind of a small town vibe to... just the ear thing, like what you hear, in a small town, like rumors, and some of them are not true, but some of them are. It's just, there's a lot of the darkness happens because you hear of something. And it was just interesting to me that Lynch chose for the ear to be cut off at the beginning. It's not like Jeffrey discovers it by hearing something, but it instigates it. And then what he hears from Sandy when he first sees her, when she emerges from the darkness, he goes on his investigation based on what he hears from her. So there's just a kind of like cycle of people hearing things from other people. And it also just kind of made me think of that old quote, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, if I'm even getting that in the right order. Because there's even a blind guy that runs the hardware store. Yeah. Right? And
how many fingers am I holding up?
Right. Exactly. And then we're not hearing, or we are hearing, right? Or we're pretending that we're not hearing. If Jeffrey didn't care about what he heard, then none of this would be revealed and Dorothy's son would never be saved. Right? So there's just something very interesting about that. And speak no evil. It's, there's this sense that like, oh, we can't say something that's outside of the norm. We can't approach each other and speak the truth about the world. And I looked into it further, and it is possibly comes from Confucius, who said, look not at what is propriety, listen not to what is propriety and speak not what is contrary to propriety, that is. The properness of proper society, conforming to society. And I felt like there was something really baked into this story that Lynch is trying to give us here. And now, closing sequence, we have Jeffrey hearing the good things, the right things. And again, he wouldn't be having this experience of hearing that bird unless he heard the wrong thing, the dark thing, the bad thing, and acted on it. And Sandy guided him through it in the right way. The two of them worked together to discover their own love and to save Dorothy Valens. So I think that just works perfectly with Lynch's whole idea here of uprooting the whole idea of just conforming, staying in line, living that pretty little idealistic, picturesque life, and then nothing further beyond that. It's like, no, look at the world for what it is. Discover what it is. Contend with what it is. And then you will also live in that authenticity, and you will also be presented with all of the beautiful aspects of the world as well. It goes both ways. Did that come across at all?
I think so. I think what he's doing with the ear, the close-ups, and the severed ear is a sort of... I think he's doing two things here. I think he's doing some body horror gross out, and I think he's doing some subversions of crime story, mystery, neo-noir, investigation, procedural type of thing. Because in the beginning of most of those kind of genre movies, you come across a body, or you might come across maybe a different severed, like a finger or something like that. But in this one, he chooses an ear, which is really gross and different. It's probably one of the only movies you could say somebody finds a severed ear in the grass.
Right.
I definitely can't list any others.
But again, I thought there was a lot of meaning in it. Like, he chose the ear for a reason, I think.
Okay. I understand your interpretation of it, and I don't think David Lynch thought about it.
Okay. I would love to ask him.
Yeah, his thinking was more along the lines of what would be weird and disgusting and disturbing to find on the ground that isn't something that someone's done before. And
but to defend him, back to the closing sequence, it starts with that extreme close-up of the ear and zooms out. So it's not random in that respect. He's making
correct.
It seems random, I think, in the way of, you can say, oh, that was just an inciting incident, right? But it's not just an inciting incident. It's an incident that connects with very strong, deliberate imagery that closes out the film before the curtain closes.
But it's also because he's choosing to do that. And I think this scene could also just be kind of weird and gross. I think sometimes some of his stuff is just kind of like that. I would have to... It's been a long time since I've watched Eraserhead, but I remember finding next to nothing in it. At least not compared to the other things I've read on Letterboxd and heard from other people that have watched the movie and love it and rave about it. Getting all this sort of stuff from the imagery of Eraserhead that I just didn't get at all. But in this one, I really think it's a little more to do with what's weird and gross and dark, and to make you think. Like, we just saw Frank get shot in the forehead and collapse to the ground, and now we're seeing like a very violent death. And now we're seeing kind of the living inside anatomy of ourselves. I think it's a lot of that thinking of life and death, maybe. So we saw severed ear, dead in the beginning of the movie, to living ear. And it's gross and weird and dark and disturbing to be inside someone's body and to pull out from it. I think it's more that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, listen, there are certain stylistic things and choices on the part of Lynch that are definitely objectively gross and weird and off-putting, right? But we did say that there's the huge theme in here is that there's a lot of darkness and ugliness in the world. That ear is supposed to be, that's the breadcrumb, that sets him on the trail toward discovering the underbelly of the world in which he lives. The world, the hometown that he's always loved and appreciated, and it is what it is. It's a quiet, simple place that has, lumber industry and so on. It's not supposed to be violent crime, but this is the breadcrumb that leaves him there. And if that's supposed to be representative of the dark underbelly, disturbing ugliness of society that does exist, then I would argue that it has to be something that's somewhat disturbing, because that's what it's supposed to represent. So, but I totally understand how that could be more off-putting than anything else to you, and the stuff about Eraserhead and so on. The other thing I want to touch on really fast before we go is the very final image. I think that some of the stuff at the end, perfectly bookending with the beginning, like the white picket fence and the fire truck and stuff, some of that's a little bit cheesy to me. And I also do think that the bird puppet is a little bit cheesy, but it's very Lynch, so, whatever. But I love this final image, Stonehouse, of this final shot, the boy running into Dorothy's arms. And I really think that that is the image that we've been waiting for the whole movie since meeting Dorothy. You could say that Jeffrey finding love, yeah, kind of predictable. We sort of expect to see that. But the real, conflict in the movie, aside from, let's say, Jeffrey and Sandy trying to work out the kinks and find their love, if that could be called a conflict, but the real tension, the suspense, the conflict of the movie is Dorothy not even just regaining her sanity, that alone is a conflict, but reuniting with the boy, finding that innocence again, and finding a reason to be alive, and not just be a sex toy for some psychotic maniac. I was moved by that image. And I do have to say, because we have recurring guests on here, John Bewley, I watched that thing with Adam Secafico and John Bewley. I watched John watching it for the first time. And John became very emotional in the end, after this final image, and the music played over the blue curtains again. And I'll never forget that, because he was absolutely mesmerized. John, I hope that you don't mind us talking about this, but I do hope that you guys out there have the privilege at some point of watching a friend who's very close to you be moved in this way. It's astonishing, because it's almost as if his soul left his body and, was showing for us somehow. And we weren't as moved. We were kind of transfixed. But I remember you, Stonehouse, saying something in the last episode we did, The Wailing, about great directors being able to hypnotize the audience. And I watched a person be hypnotized and moved practically to tears. He was speechless for a little while after we turned the movie off. He had to gather his thoughts. I mean, this kind of an ending, it gives me chills, because there's so much conflict about this woman. It's so tragic, back to what I was saying before. And then we finally see this sort of resolution. And it really does affect me every time I see it. And I think about my friend being affected too. And that affects me even more.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that John has no business minding us talking about this, because he got to put on Satoshi Kon's Millennium Actress for me and watch me cry at the ending of that. So,
all right, good. So then John has had the privilege of seeing that too. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. Never underestimate
he's got the experience
that.
in the bag too.
That's awesome.
But I mean, Millennium Actress is quite the movie, and the way that one is able to emotionally dig into you in a runtime of something close to 90 minutes is really powerful.
Well, I haven't seen it, but I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. But so for the Blue Velvet ending, what you're getting here is a very deserved payoff, with the whole movie as setup of just really piling it on top of this poor woman, of her one bad thing after another. And I can understand again why Roger Ebert and others could say this is exploitative and they felt bad for the actress more so than the character having to go through these things. But in that final image, what you're getting is the emotional payoff of all she's been through, because the light has overcome the dark. I wish I wrote down the original quote that was in Blue Velvet, but I only wrote down the quote it reminded me of, which is, "The dark nights, the night is darkest just before the dawn." Someone said something very similar in Blue Velvet, so I wrote that down. I wish I had written down what was in this movie, but it is kind of ties into the ending of this. But yeah, so that all that setup gives you this positive emotional payoff that we get, that continues that through line of the Jeffrey and Sandy story, of them coming through the other side of that tunnel. They go through, experience the darkness. That's a good metaphor, the literal darkness and the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
So this is the light at the end of the tunnel. And that was her motivation. Her primary motivation of the entire movie was being reunited with her son. You see it when Frank is like saying, okay, I'm not going to repeat exactly what he says, but he says, let her see her kid.
Yeah.
And then you see her immediately, like her eyes get all bright, and she runs over to him, because it's her not sole motivation. I guess she wants to save her husband too, but her biggest priority is being reunited with her son, it's very tragic too, because in that scene, I think there's a little bit of audio. They don't show it. They just show them behind the room. There's a little bit of audio where she is defensive. It almost sounds like the kid is resentful that she's been gone, and she's trying to make up for the time lost, but the kid doesn't understand why she was gone. He doesn't understand the kidnapping scenario, because he's not really being held. He's being like taken care of by this Ben's house of weirdos, whatever's going on.
Yeah, she's like, no, mommy loves you. You have to understand that. Yeah.
So even that scene, you don't get to feel the full emotional resonance of her being reunited with her son, because even that is taken away from her by this manipulation, this mental manipulation that they're doing to the kid. Probably not on purpose. I don't think they care enough to separate the kid mentally from his mother. I don't think they're smart or care enough about that. They're just getting what they want by keeping them physically separated.
Right.
But that scene is really key to the ending, even though it's just like a 5-second audio clip in the larger part of the movie, to get that context, and then the ending where it is clear that her son loves her and that she's made it through whatever has gone on, for him to be free, them to be together, and then to reunite, to share that love together. She has the love that's been missing in her life for so long. Yeah,
it's awesome. It's quite a moving final image.
And it's a different kind of love too than Jeffrey and Sandy is a romantic love, and this is a familial love, a maternal love, a love of a family.
Yeah. So ultimately it really is a very positive ending, and very romantic and filled with love, just like Sandy wanted. So the fan question for this episode is, what do you think is actually wrong with Frank Booth? Give us your best and most accurate diagnosis. I want to know what is actually wrong with him. Whether it's something that's social or something that's more clinical and pathological. What the hell is actually wrong with Frank Booth? So this has been so much fun. We could probably talk about this movie for like 2 more hours. I mean, there's so much stuff that we didn't talk about, but I think that we did, Stonehouse, we hit everything that we basically wanted to. And I think we talked more about a lot about the characters and themes and our takes, and went into specific characters rather than talking about a lot of different moments in the movie and parts of the movie. But that's okay, because I really think that we both told everyone what our takes are, and that's really important here, because we just always emphasize the meaning. And this movie has a lot of interesting meaning in it, and I just think that Stonehouse, you did a great job giving us everything that we needed to know in order to understand for sure what your take on this movie is. But I think we all have things to think about for ourselves because of the wisdom that you gave us when we rewatch this movie now. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast again and gracing us with your knowledge about all of this.
Thanks. I appreciate you, having me on the show again, and I appreciate you having this conversation about the movie. And I appreciate this movie because I really do see something new every time I watch it. Like I said, this was
me
the
too.
fourth time I've watched it, and my appreciation grows each time. Like I said, the first 2 times I watched it, I didn't even like it. Then the third time I reevaluated it, I found a lot more to read into the movie, to get from it, and to feel about it, more so than just trying to figure out what was going on and what the motivations were and what things meant, but to feel it and to think it and just to have it circling in my mind. And now this fourth time talking with you and watching it again, my appreciation grows for it even more from having a new perspective of it. And when I'm sure I watch it a fifth time, I'm sure it'll grow more in my...
absolutely. And that's the whole project of what we do here. Because I feel like everything that you just said, the thinking about it and the really, chewing on it and everything, that's why these people make these movies in the first place. It's why we kill ourselves to make our movies. So I think that we could all do a little bit more thinking about the meaning in movies, because it's why they're made. Thank you for coming to the table with all that stuff for us. And thank you to all the listeners. Please like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on our Instagram channel, which is Speaking Cinema Podcast. And whatever platform that you've listened to this on, if you enjoy this content and you find it valuable, please share and subscribe or write a review. That helps us immensely and allows us to do more of the work that we're doing. So again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Stonehouse. And thank you to David Lynch for giving us a movie that gives us a different experience every single time. I'll see you on the next episode.